starting now. Good.
All right. So during my travels through the Jewish community over my life, I've noticed that there are different time periods that people wait between meat and milk. I've seen
Yes.
1 hour, 4 hours, 6 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And I've read all the things why the rabbis have had you wait between one and the other.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what happens if a group of experts get together and they said, listen, we studied all of this stuff. Meat is digested by the body, and meat that could get caught between your teeth will disintegrate with 1.5 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And within 1.5 hours, if you eat meat, it's gone.
Right.
Would rabbis today say, okay, we only have to wait 1.5 hours between eating meat and having milk? Or is everybody going to still stick to the 6 hours?
Almost everybody is going to stick with whatever it is that they've been doing up until now.
So this is like when the Pope says you could eat meat on Friday, all the people who never ate meat on Friday are going to eat meat. But what I'm saying is, would the rabbis come out, because this thing about the 6 hours was pronounced by the rabbis,
Mm-hmm.
if the scientific evidence says it's all the meat is gone from your body in 1.5 hours, do you think the rabbis would now say you can eat meat after only 1.5 hours?
Mm-hmm.
You know, people could do whatever they want, but you think the rabbis would change their minds on it?
No, almost definitely not. I don't think they would do it unless there was some kind of, well, put it this way, if there was this kind of social necessity, then there will be some rabbis that will make the change. And you know, we're seeing this actually with the with this virus situation, that you are seeing very ultra-Orthodox rabbis saying things that 2 years ago or even 3 months ago they never would have said about, you know, Zoom minyanim and about you know, other kinds of things. You're seeing it within the Orthodox community now, as far as using electronic devices on Shabbos, which is it's a really fascinating thing. But they are the use of cell phones has become so ubiquitous within the modern Orthodox community that there's a whole category of people that refer to themselves as half Shabbos, meaning that they don't shop and they don't drive and they don't do, you know, light fires and so forth, but they use their cell phones. And so even Orthodox rabbis can be nudged because of social circumstances. But there's no driving reason to change the amount of time that you wait, even if one could scientifically prove that, you know, the digestive process is completed after X number of hours. That's A. B, how are you going to get all these rabbis into the same room? All right, that's even among Orthodox rabbis, you can't get them all into the same room, much less, you know, Orthodox conservative. Conservative would be, as they have with Kitniot, that there's not so much a scientific understanding, but an historical understanding of why it is that there's a prohibition on Kitniot. And because of Israel and the mixing of Sephardic and Ashkenazic families in Israel, you have entire kosher for Pesach supermarkets that are filled with Kitniot. All right, because among the Sephardim, they use it all the time. So, and it's totally natural for them. So because of the ubiquity of it in Israel, there is an increasing move toward accepting Kitniot among Ashkenazim, and the conservative movement in Israel was the first among the conservatives to accept the use of Kitniot. In fact, the funny story about Kitniot is that the first mention we have of Kitniot in any of our classic sources, the first mention is a couple of Sephardic rabbis saying, have you heard about this crazy thing the Ashkenazim have come with about not eating Kitniot? Where'd they get that from? because I mean, that's the first time in halachic literature that we ever hear the expression kitniot. It's in reference, it's with that sarcastic comment. So it was always a problematic concept. Things could change, but there really has to be a driving necessity for them to change. And even if you said, oh, it's 1.5 hours or 2 hours or whatever it is, there's no driving necessity to change. And then on top of that, there's another level to it. And that is that sometimes you could have a custom that starts for one reason. That reason can be long gone, but the custom has become overlaid with other meaningful interpretations and has therefore its own value, even though the original meaning is gone. The classic story, it's a true story, the classic story about that is that there was the synagogue in Vienna, and people there had the custom that when they came up onto the bima, like to open the ark or something like that, that they would get up onto the bima and in a very formal way they would bow, and then they would go do whatever they were going to do.
That's the joke I told you.
Right, but it's not a joke, it's real, it's a real history. And so somebody came and said, why do you do this? And they said, oh, well, we want to express our sense of being in God's presence and show respect and so forth, which sounds very reasonable, except why don't all synagogues do that? I mean, everybody should be doing it. And it turned out that there was a chandelier over the stairs going up that was too low, and you'd bump your head if you didn't do it. So they turned it into a bow and formalized it. And when they fixed the chandelier, everybody still knew how to bow. And so you don't say, well, you don't really have to do this anymore, because they'd already overlaid it with this idea, the meaning of, using this as an opportunity to express your respect for God. So, that's reason enough to keep on doing it. I had a professor once who made the distinction between, his name was Dr. Zucker, and brilliant Talmudist, and he was teaching a class on halacha, and he was pointing out some sort of oddities in Jewish law. And then at the end of the class, he said, now I want you to understand, that was Zucker. This is halacha. All right, this is, me doing my theoretical things. That's all very nice. But halacha is, the law that you're supposed to follow is this thing over here. He was able to make that distinction between his theoretical discussions and what we continue to do.
I'll tell you what else is very interesting from being in like many, many different shuls. When they say Yizkor, some shuls put the Torahs away. Some shuls leave the Torahs open. Some shuls close the Torahs and cover it. Some shuls, someone stands and holds. Just 8,000 different ways of doing things.
Yeah, and it really depends on, to some extent, it depends on the timing of Yizkor, because the sort of most common thing, and what you would do on something other than the high holidays, is that you're doing Yizkor sort of as part of the Torah service. That you're doing the Torah service, the Torah is out, you do the Haftorah, and then at that point, you would probably do the Yizkor service, and then after that, the blessings on the country and Israel and peace, and then the Ashrei, and then put the Torahs away. Or alternatively, you would say those various blessings on the country and Israel and peace, and then Yizkor, and then Ashrei, and then put the Torahs away. But particularly on the high holidays, because of timing concerns, sometimes you hold off on Yizkor until some other time. We do it because we're trying to nudge people to stay in the service, because we have this weird situation where once we finish my sermon and Yizkor, and it's time for the cantor to...
it's the Exodus.
That's the Exodus, which is nuts, because that's, the most beautiful part of the service. It's, the cantor is going to do what he's been waiting all year to do. So why leave now? It's crazy. So we try and set it up in such a way that like the cantor has a chance to do Hineni, and that we open the ark right away so that maybe people will freeze in their seats for a little bit before they leave. And so that means that the Torah has already been put away by the time we come around to Yizkor. So then the question is, well, do you need to take the Torahs out? You don't need to, but people are used to seeing the Torahs out while we're doing Yizkor, so that's what we do.
You could say Yizkor in the absence of a Torah, right?
Oh yeah, you can say Yizkor in the absence of a minyan. You can say Yizkor. You don't have to be in shul to say Yizkor. Yeah, for sure. So it is merely customary. It's like, if the Torahs are out, I'd be shocked if somebody isn't holding up the Torahs. There's just, of course you would hold up the Torahs. But if the Torahs are not out, there's not a necessity to bring them out. It's just, people are sort of used to seeing that. So that's why we do.
Sure. Rabbi, I was having a discussion this morning with Elliot Danto.
Oh, how's he doing?
They're doing well. They're doing
God.
well. And we started to discuss the 10 Commandments. Are some of the commandments, I hate to use the term more, but more important than the others? Or even we made it broader, are some of the mitzvahs more important? Or are they all real? A mitzvah is a mitzvah, a commandment. Yeah. So what is the Jewish law on that?
A mitzvah is a mitzvah. They're all of equal importance. And the thing that distinguishes the 10 Commandments, this is almost everybody agrees with this, the thing that distinguishes the 10 Commandments is that all of the other mitzvot can be categorized as being subsumed under one or another of those commandments. So, for example, all of the laws of sacrifice and so forth can be subsumed under, you shall have no other gods before me. And, all of the property laws could be subsumed under thou shalt not steal, and all the laws of sexuality under, you shall not commit adultery. And so, that's, they're sort of like the chapter headings or the bolded parts of the outline. But the mitzvot in and of themselves, every mitzvah is an equal mitzvah. And the rabbis go at great length to say, they do distinguish between the mitzvot whose rationale seems compelling, thou shalt not murder, and mitzvot whose rationale is not compelling, don't use shatnez, obviously we can really wrap our heads around don't murder and understanding shatnez, although there's an explanation for shatnez. It's not as compelling as thou shalt not murder. All right. But in terms of value, the rabbis say, a sort of a prominent mitzvah should be as meaningful to you, or a not prominent mitzvah, simple mitzvah, should be as meaningful to you as one of the heavy-duty mitzvot. And that's one of the reasons there's an interesting history there, because it used to be that in the temple in Jerusalem, they used to read the 10 Commandments as part of the daily service. And then with the rise of Christianity, the 10 Commandments, even though the temple is destroyed, with the rise of Christianity, the 10 Commandments were removed from the Shacharit service. They did not include them, precisely for the reason that the Christians did emphasize the 10 Commandments and distinguish them from all of the other commandments as, this is like the quickie version, just do this and you'll be fine. And thereby seeking to exclude all of the laws about kashrut and family purity and all the rest of that. And so the rabbis were afraid that by just listing the 10 Commandments, that would be, so to speak, tempting the people to buy into this idea that that's all you really have to do. And so they removed it from the service because they didn't want to give that impression. That, by the way, going back to Erwin's earlier question, the rabbis saw a necessity in making a change, and so they did. that's it was a very intentional choice. Because if you think about it, it's a somewhat glaring absence. You would really expect there to be, the Ten Commandments, or even, think about the high holidays. If you were to like wave your magic wand and say, well, gee, what should I read on the high holidays? All right, you would imagine that it's the creation of the world, so you would read Genesis, and it's the Day of Judgment, so you read the Ten Commandments. And you don't do either. So it's when you read about creation, you're reading about the creation of the Jewish people, and when you read about commandments, what you're reading about is either the Yom Kippur sacrifice, or on the afternoon of Yom Kippur, you're reading about the laws of sexuality. It's very Freudian, and it's I think a conscious effort to de-emphasize the Ten Commandments. They get their due later. We do Shavuos, and that's a different story. But for that big public reading, when you would expect it, that's when you don't get it.
If Arthur, can I throw another question in?
Of course.
Okay.
As long as it's not to me.
I can't find anything anywhere which talks about the shape of a talus. And I was thinking, you look at what kind of clothes the ancient people were presumed to wear. You would think that the tzitzit would be more of what a talus should look like. You throw it over your head, you got a hole in the middle, it comes down.
Uh-huh.
So is there any evidence of what or when this particular shape of the garment came in? I mean, it makes it seem like it should be the other way.
That's interesting, and I don't know the answer to that question.
Well, we could turn our things off, and you come back when you find out.
We could do that. The only thing we know is if you have a garment that has four corners.
Right. Yeah. Right. I understand.
But, a toga. I don't know, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure if we found clothes enough to know what their shirt would have looked like. Would it be a sort of over the head, sort of like the tzitzit,
like a serape?
Yeah, like a serape, or like the arbakanfot that the tzitzit that we wear, on a daily basis. Is that the way they did it? I'm not sure, because that's a harder form of sewing or whatever, weaving.
It looks like it'd be easier. You just take a piece of cloth, a big piece of cloth, to cut a hole in the middle. You put it over your head. That's the easiest thing, though.
That's why you're a lawyer and not a tailor, because it's not so easy to keep it from fraying and all the rest of it. Nobody's going to make a piece of cloth and then waste that much.
Oh, well, but back then they might not have worn it all day long, like tzitzit or like that. It may have been just when they prayed.
Possible, although I suspect not. I suspect they were wearing it all the time. Yeah. I'm pretty sure they would have been wearing it all the time, but I'm not exactly sure how the clothes were constructed. I'll have to check and see whether we really know anything about that or not. I got a couple of sources I'll have to look.
Just nothing. Do you know what that clicking noise is that it keeps coming on? That's not coming from your end, is it?
There is a chirp coming from my end. We've got one of our alarms needs a new battery. So every now and then you hear.
Well, my house, the chirp doesn't go off till like 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, now you might have just heard it 2 seconds ago.
Yeah, right. So that's what I've been hearing. Okay.
Yeah, I've discovered, and it's like I realized now, back in New York when I was living in an apartment in New York, I was living near where the subway gets elevated, and it was really loud. and somebody said, after a while you won't hear it, and they're right that there's some mechanism where you just tune it out entirely,
sure.
and you don't.
My first apartment in Elizabeth that we lived in, we were right under the flight path of the airplanes going to Newark Airport. After a little while, you didn't hear it.
Yeah, where if somebody's visiting the house, they'll be ducking under a table.
And they say that mothers and newborn, parents of newborns,
mm-hmm.
that their mind is attuned. They'll hear the baby, but they won't hear buses going outside.
Right. Sure. I mean, they say about like penguins, there are a million penguins on the beach, but they can recognize the sound of their own baby. And I have come to understand that. I have come to understand that. It's, when I hear like a kid screaming in synagogue, my immediate reaction is, it's not mine. I don't care. It's not my business. It's somebody else's problem. So what else is going on?
So since no one else is throwing in a question, I'll give you a question to keep you occupied.
Keep me occupied.
What a rabbi before you had this custom: if you didn't have a minyan when Baruch Hu was to be said, and then a minyan came about during the service, you could go back and say Baruch Hu.
Right. Yeah.
So explain that.
Yeah, I have heard that said. I've seen it done. And it is, the reason that you would do it is simply because you can do it. It's a part of a service. You couldn't do it at the beginning. You can do it at the end, so you go ahead and do it.
Right.
My problem is that what that is the call to prayer.
Right, it's a call to prayer. You're already praying.
Right, and so to do it all the way at the end it strikes me as a little bit clumsy. Now, what I have seen is that it's not the guy leading services who does it, but it's the guy who comes in late that does it.
Oh, I never saw that. Because
if the guy who comes in late does it, then he actually, there's sort of a value added. He calls everybody to prayer, and they say their prayer, and then he's able to repeat it, so he actually has done something that he hasn't done to that point. All right, that's that is he has fulfilled a responsibility that because he missed other prayers earlier on in the service, he now is sort of compensating for that. Whereas we who have been there from the beginning, we have been doing our prayers. So to me, that has somewhat more of a rationale than just the Shaliach Tzibur just, repeating it just because we now have a minyan. Now, the other thing that I have seen is that if we don't have a minyan at the beginning, like for example, sometimes on Shabbos morning, we won't have a minyan right at the beginning, and then we'll miss that first Kaddish. And then a couple of minutes later, we're still doing Psukei de Zimra, and then the minyan shows up. All right, I have been in synagogues that once that minyan shows up, that we then stop and do Kaddish. Because, you're following, after any of the Psalms, you could do the Kaddish. But that hasn't been our custom here, so I'm not making a big deal about it. It's a theoretical thing, but it's a little bit, it can get a little bit clunky also. You do want the service to flow. There's a concept called a tircha de tzibur, a burden on the congregation. And people sort of want a flow of what they're doing, of what they expect, what's coming next. They're moving away from sort of the sort of conscious effort of now I'm going to this page and now I'm going to that page, and they're getting into their flow of davening that they're used to, and they don't want that interrupted. It's like, that's why one of the reasons I hate announcing pages. And it is something in the long run that I want to work on more. people come to our services a lot. All right. Right now it's crazy, right? But under normal circumstances, almost everybody who's there on a Shabbos morning has been there on a Shabbos morning many, many, many times. With just a little bit of effort, they would be able to recognize whatever page we're on. They could figure it out. I really sort of want to gear people up for that so that we're not constantly interrupting with announcing pages.
I was at a shul when I grew up where they had numbers on the bima, and they would flip the numbers. So when you came in, you could always see what page you were on.
Right.
So
right.
It didn't interrupt the service, but it kept everybody apprised of where you were.
Right. The small problem with that is that is manpower.
Well,
I'm sure that in your shul that there were a whole bunch of people that could have been standing next to that sign flipping pages. There are probably a whole bunch of kids that could have been standing next to that sign flipping pages.
The only problem was back then when I went there, everybody brought their own machzer. So everybody was on a different page.
Different page, right. Yeah, that was actually a contribution by our Reform brethren. There's a great story about that, about the first Reform synagogue in Britain. And the story goes like this, that in the year, I think it was 1815, and the next year, there was going to be a vote in Parliament about whether Jews would be allowed to vote. In 1814, if I remember correctly, but certainly the year before, a book came out that was entitled Strange Sects on the British Isles. And it talked about Muhammadans, and it talked about Druids, and it talked about Jews. And it described what a Jewish service looked like. And what does a Jewish service look like? Nobody knows when it starts. Nobody knows when it ends. You walk in, some people are standing up, some people are sitting down. They don't all have the same book in front of them. They're singing different tunes. They're singing out of tune. You don't know who's in charge of it. It's a total balagan. That's not the word they use, but it's a total balagan. And this comes out the year before they're going to have the vote about whether Jews are going to be accepted in Parliament or Jews be allowed to vote. So there's an emergency board meeting. And by the end of the emergency board meeting, they announced that all services will begin at 9:30. All services will end at 12 o'clock. Everybody is going to be using such and such a prayer book. The rabbi will give a sermon every day, and he will wear robes so that he will be easily identifiable. There's going to be a choir that's going to lead everybody in prayer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because they wanted the service, not that they wanted to be like the Goyim. They didn't want to be perceived as other. They didn't care that their service looked the way that it did. On a personal basis, they were perfectly happy with it. They were envious of the non-Jewish way of doing things. But there was a political necessity in making them look like the English. And so that's what they did. Because of that, I have to give a sermon every week. The Mamzer.
I'll tell you a great story along those lines.
Yes.
When we first started having services every day, okay, I was leading services in the main sanctuary, and we had, I think, 7 men and 3 women in the sanctuary. And this guy comes in for services, and he starts making a big fuss. You can't have these services. You need 10 men. You can't count women. And I said, I'm trying to appease him. I said, it's okay. If you don't want to be part of our service, if this offends you, your sensibilities, they have a service in Highland Park. They have a service in East Brunswick.
Right.
He says, no, this is not right. I have to say Kaddish. You don't have a minyan. You can't have these services. And I said, oh, well, whatever. And he proceeds to walk in front of me, up on a beamer, says Kaddish, and then leaves.
I'm glad he left.
No, but I'm saying he's making a deal. We don't have a minyan, and he goes up and says Kaddish.
And then he says Kaddish.
Yeah.
Thank you. It takes all kinds.
Yeah.
So we've been joined by somebody else. I'm not sure who you are because all I see is your phone number, but welcome.
I guess it's me. Trouble.
Hi, Jay.
Hi.
Good. So we're just doing question and answers. So, yeah, I actually had a vaguely similar, not quite as extreme, but a vaguely similar experience when somebody came into our services in Savannah and started lecturing us on the way that things were supposed to be. And the chutzpah that's involved there, that somebody would arrogate to themselves the right to, I mean, could you imagine somebody walking into a church and telling them that they're doing their service wrong?
Well,
only Jews do things like this.
I used to go to OE in Highland Park.
Uh-huh.
And when they would say Kaddish, it was like a free-for-all. Guys would be yelling. Guys were going at a different speed. All done.
Yeah.
And one day, after I've been there going for about 7 months or 8 months, I missed a couple of weeks and I came back. And I now notice when they said, "Oh, say Shalom Bimromav" at the end, and they take the 3 steps back,
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden they're doing it differently.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm there over a year, and they're doing it one way to doing it. And I said, "Oh, why are you doing this?" He said, "Some guys from the yeshiva came and did it a different way, so we figured they knew how to do it better than us." So.
That's great. That's great. But I'll tell you, I have a personal take on that. I always, some of my colleagues, you might have noticed, some of my colleagues don't lead the Kaddish. They just let who's ever saying Kaddish say Kaddish. But I always lead the Kaddish, and I'll tell you why I always.
You try to keep a pace, right?
Yeah, because my father, Zichrono Livracha, all right, he was not in any way learned. He had his bar mitzvah when he was 60 years old. And the reason that he had his bar mitzvah at 60 years old is that his mother, my grandmother, may she rest in peace, died when my father was 58 years old. And he had to go and say Kaddish, which he had never done. And so he was struggling to work with like the transliteration because he couldn't read any Hebrew letters. And so he was struggling with it, trying to get the words out. And I was in rabbinical school already. All right, so you know, this was wait, was I in rabbinical school already? Let me think for a second.
I think you started rabbinical school a year later.
Yeah, let me think for a second. So Dad was 60. That would have made him 75. Right. So I was just going to rabbinical. I was just starting at rabbinical school, and my grandmother died. So, but I would, you know, when I was with my father, I would, you know, in town, I would go to Minyan with him, and so my father's struggling to say the words, and so a couple of the hot shots were there, and just, you know, sort of whipping through it. And I remember my father looking with such resentment at them, how angry he was that they were making it impossible for him to concentrate. You can imagine when he's struggling just to say the English words and the distraction of all these people just zipping through it because they can do it that fast. And I said to myself, you know, I want to make sure nobody hurts people in my shul that way. Because that's really what they do. Okay, hold on 1 second. Hi, Gary. Okay, I am doing my question and answer group right now, my Zoom. Can I talk to you afterwards? Will do. Okay, bye-bye.
You know,
good. So that's why I insist on doing it, to try and set a pace that everybody can follow, so that even if a hotshot comes in, still people will hear my voice and be able to sort of anchor on it.
You know,
Go.
I always felt that, and I ask rabbis that I run into and cantors that I run into, I always say, what do you think is the most important prayer that we say during the course of the year? And I hear Shema, the Amida, and I say, realistically, it's the Kaddish. I mean, people come, they'll talk through the service, and then when I have to say Kaddish, they'll stand up and they'll say the Kaddish, because that means a lot more to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure what prayer. I mean, it's sort of like the commandments. We were having that discussion before. You know, which is the most important prayer? The most important prayer is the one that you say with good kavanah. That's the most important prayer. You know, the one that you really can speak from your heart.
I'm wondering, is Shema as a prayer or as a statement?
It's a very complicated question, Jay. It's a very complicated question because obviously the Shema, unlike what comes before it and what comes after it, are simply direct quotes from the Torah. You know, they're not composed in any way. There's no blessing in them or something like that. It's not rabbinic language at all. It's just quotes from the Torah. So clearly it's a kind of declaration. So that it does have, and there's all kinds of complexity about it, about a debate about whether you need to have kavanah when you're saying the Shema. Can you say it in any language, or can you say it in translation, or do you have to say it, you know, as it is written in the Hebrew? Is it meant to be a cognitive experience where you are sort of expressing and noting these concepts, or is it meant to be a ritual experience where you are reciting these words or singing these melodies? This is a big debate in the Talmud. It's a major discussion in the Talmud, and people, as you might expect, are on both sides of that issue. That's, you know, and yeah, when you say the Shema itself, it's clearly a declaration. You know, you are bearing witness. I actually just wrote my thing about prayer, and for this week, and it talks about how you are bearing witness by reciting the Shema. That's why the big letters at the end of Shema and the end of Echad are you know why they're written big, because they spell, it's ayin dalet, it spells out aid, it spells out witness. So you are, pardon the Christian expression, you are witnessing when you say the Shema. So yeah, that's a great question to which there's not one simple answer. Good. Other thoughts?
Rabbi, of the patriarchs, of course, Avraham and Yaakov, their names were changed. Avram to Avraham.
Right.
And Yaakov to Yisrael. Yitzchak's, I don't think, was changed.
Not changed.
Is there any thoughts on that, or just something that just didn't happen? Or?
Right. Well, I mean, one of the explanations that I've seen, which is a really powerful explanation, is that the transformation for Yitzchak was a very traumatic transformation. Right. Remember, for Yitzchak, he was virtually sacrificed.
Sure. Yes.
So there was a kind of alienation there, that from the time that Abraham almost sacrificed Yitzchak, they never speak again. All right. There's no further conversation between the two of them, even though, you know, they're going up the mountain and they're really together, and there's a clear sense of emotion. For Yitzchak, there's trauma there. He is a traumatized child. There's a theory that you know, the next parsha is Chayei Sarah. Yes. So there's a theory that when Sarah heard that Abraham was going to sacrifice her, she died of a heart attack. So, you know, here is this kid whose mother dies of a heart attack and his father was on the verge of taking his life, he was never able to really adequately recover from that. So, he did not go through that successful transformation, where Abraham had his trials, and was transformed. Jacob had his trials and was transformed. Yitzchak never had a chance to experience that transformation. His life is a difficult life, where by the end he's blind, he's deceived by his wife and by one of his children. His life is sort of a disaster area. That's what happens when you're a korban, when you're a sacrifice. He was sacrificed.
Thank you.
We had a kind of a guest rabbi who gave a haftorah, or one of the haftorahs during Yom Kippur, and he said it always annoyed him that Abraham didn't argue with, because Abraham was talking to God all the time back then, that he didn't argue with God. What do you mean you want me to sacrifice myself? I don't want to do this. And he never said anything to him.
Right. Well, there's this is it's sort of like one of the classic things that you study when you're learning sort of biblical literature. There was this great literary critic named Eric Auerbach. He taught at Yale. And he has this essay called The Scar of Odysseus, Ulysses. And what he does in that essay is that he distinguishes between the way Homer writes in the Odyssey and the way the story of Abraham and Isaac is told in the Torah. And what he says is this, that when you read the Odyssey, you're at this really dramatic moment near the end. And this is when Odysseus is coming home. And he's about to have this confrontation with all of the suitors that are, they have been molesting his wife. And so this big drama is going to happen. And it's mentioned that he was recognized because he had this scar in his leg. And then at this really dramatic moment, it goes into this very detailed story about the scar and how he got the scar. And you're sitting there, you're waiting, for this big dramatic event to happen. And instead you're diverted to this other story. And it fills in it goes into a lot of detail about the scar and how he got it and so forth. And Auerbach contrasts that with the biblical style. And in the biblical style, what he does is he takes the story of Abraham and Isaac and the Akedah, the sacrifice story, the binding. And what he says is that if you remember the story, God says to Abraham to sacrifice his son. And they load up the donkey with the supplies. And then it says, and 3 days later, they got to the place that God had said. And so this goes now to Erwin, to your question, or to the comment that your friend made, right? The Torah doesn't tell us anything about what happened in those 3 days. And it's an open invitation for us to imagine what those 3 days must have looked like. Where, how Abraham would have argued with God, we have to fill in the blank on that. We have to assume that over the course of those 3 days, there was an awful lot of arguing with God, and that, instead of the Torah telling us what that conversation was like, we have to figure out what that conversation was like. So it forces us to be participants in the discussion.
Well,
and as opposed to the Homeric style, which is he'll fill in all the details for us. And he does it beautifully, of course, but we don't have to think an awful lot. We just have to sort of accept. Whereas the Torah style is to force us into the conversation and to make us think it through ourselves.
Wait,
So it's the Torah, it's part of the genius of the Torah not to tell us how Abraham argued with God. We already know that Abraham knows how to argue. We've already seen him do that with Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Now it's our job. Now we've already been introduced to, if you think about the Torah's literature, we've already been introduced to the idea of Abraham as the arguer, all right? Now it's up to us to apply that in this situation.
but you would think that he didn't argue with God in those 3 days, because Isaac, when they got up to the mountain, had no idea he was going to be the sacrifice. And if Abraham would have been arguing with God for the 3 days, it's only the 2 of them or 3 of them out traveling, a servant and the 2 of them, he would have had to hear something about, what do you mean you want me to kill my son or sacrifice my son? Isaac would have heard it.
It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be a verbal discussion.
Right.
It could have been an internal discussion.
Internally, yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be shouting at him. He's shouting internally. All right.
So, Rabbi, if I can ask, if we assume Abraham did argue with God, but so what was God's intentions then to let this go through to almost the bitter end and turn Yitzchak, as you just explained to us, into sort of a weakened individual and so on? What was the point of that? Just so Abraham will prove he loves God? Or God didn't know that? What was the intention then?
I've been watching this television program called Hunters. Have you heard about this program or seen this program? It's a very weird program. It's a very odd program. Keeping a long story short, it's a bunch of people in the 1970s who are hunting Nazis who have come to America. All right. And what it does is that it has flashbacks back to the concentration camps. And it describes these sort of really sort of ornately sadistic things that were going on in the concentration camps. Gut-wrenching, sadistic games that the Nazis would play, and various kinds of acts of courage and resistance on the parts of Jews who were subjected to this. And you could look at this and say, how after that could anybody continue to be Jewish? How could, after this kind of, let's call it torture, whether, pure physical torture, psychological, emotional torture, pure, ugly, sadistic torture, and being massively subjected to that, where did we, I realized that there were some people who basically said, all right, that's it, I'm out of here. I don't want to have anything more to do with Judaism. But surprisingly few, relatively speaking. The vast majority of us maintained, even if a wounded relationship, but maintain a relationship with Judaism. Where did we get that strength from? And I think the case could be made that we got it from the example of Abraham. That God, in his wisdom, was telling us that we're going to be brought to the brink. That over the course of time, over the course of the centuries, everything will be asked of us. Everything we could imagine will be asked of us. More than we could tolerate. More than any reasonable human being could imagine themselves accepting. That's going to be asked of us. It's sort of like when I was in rabbinical school, one of my teachers, well, you might know Rabbi Bill Horn. He's Dasi Mark's father up in Summit, a great, great rabbi and great teacher. And he said, anything you could imagine, you're going to deal with as a rabbi. You pick the weirdest kind of situations, rape, incest, suicide, anything you could fantasize, you're going to deal with it as a rabbi. Sooner or later, you're going to get that call and you're going to have to deal with it. And I think that the story of Abraham really sort of prepares us for that. And in a sense, we do sacrifice our children on the altar of our commitment to Judaism. You know, if we all just sort of ran away from it, and people do, you know, they run away from it. They don't give their kids any sense of Jewish identity. The kids might not even know that they're Jewish. They're totally alienated from it. They're trying to save their children from ever having to experience any of this stuff. I don't necessarily like their choice, but I can understand their choice. The story of Abraham tells us how far we're going to get pushed, because we really are going to get pushed that far. As a matter of fact, during the Crusades, or shortly after the Crusades, a kind of midrash developed among the German Jews, who in many cases would kill their children rather than allow them to be forcibly converted. And the midrash developed that Isaac was in fact killed and then brought back to life by God's tears. And a variant on that theme, you'll see it in poetry from the period, is you only asked Abraham to sacrifice his children, but he didn't have to. We had to. So it's like, he was on this level, we're on that level, we're on a higher level because we actually had to do what you had sort of tempted Abraham or suggested to Abraham. We actually had to do that with our own kids. And it's kind of not so much, I guess partially a complaint to God, but also, a prayer and asking for protection. Look how much we were prepared to sacrifice, bring our children back, through the coming of the Messiah, the way you did with Isaac. So I suspect that is the reason why. And I think that might be the reason why we read it on Yom Kippur. On Rosh Hashanah. The first day of Rosh Hashanah, we read about the birth of Isaac. All right. The next day we read about the trial. And so Rosh Hashanah is a time both of great, celebration of rebirth and also a time of great trepidation. It's a very interesting psychological and emotional combination. And the two aspects of the story of Isaac, I think, have to do with that. That on the one hand, the beloved son comes to late stage, everybody's celebrating, it's wonderful, they're giving parties, that's great. And the next one, he's being sacrificed. So that's a great question. I never really had to think about it, but I think it's a great question. Good. So what else, guys?
Everybody's okay, Rabbi?
Yeah, thank
Everyone's
God.
okay.
Yeah, we're hanging in there. Some of the kids are chomping at the bit to get out. One is like perfectly content to sleep. And the dog's loving having us all around. That's great. So
a friend sent us a joke where a neighbor is talking to the wife and saying, I was looking, you told me your husband was in the garden. I was looking, I didn't see him. The wife said, dig a little deeper.
Yeah, I wonder what the statistics are going to be about both births 9 months from now and spousal abuse. I could see a lot of both. The crime rate going up, it's all kinds of things.
I'm going to sign off because I have to go spend time with the wife.
That
I couldn't imagine a better reason. Give our regards.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Good night, Erwin. Be well. Be safe.
So, Jay, what's on your mind?
Well, I was thinking as you were talking about name changing, and I came across my namesake, Jacob, and I thought that whereas we always know the difference with Abraham, what is excuse me, what is before and what is after. When we call him Avram or Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
But Jacob, I was taught that it's a question of what the situation is. If he's acting in God's stead, it's Israel.
Right.
But if he's acting as a heel, it's Yaakov.
Yeah. And there's a passage right after he gets the big name change after wrestling with the angel.
Yeah.
In the next paragraph, it says, and so Jacob then went to talk to Isaac, or to Esau, and so right after he got the name changed, it reverted back to to Jacob. So it wasn't this kind of permanent change; it was an ambivalent personality, and we see that with Jacob. There is a certain nobility with Jacob. He does some very noble things, but also he's a heel. He's a sneaky guy, and he gets cut off with a bunch of sneaky stuff, and he pays a big price for it as well. And so that it's when Lincoln was talking about the better angels of our nature, he could have been speaking to Jacob, encouraging him to be Israel more than he's Jacob. But we all do that, right? We all have that noble aspect of our personality and the not so noble aspect of our personality.
But we don't have a name change.
No, we don't. Although, people can call us all kinds of names. Yeah.
I mentioned to my grandchildren a couple of years ago that when we came over from Europe, we changed our name from Smith to Cedarbaum. They put, I always try to kid, and they just looked at me. They didn't know where am I coming from with this.
Did they even know about Ellis Island and
they did, because they had a grandmother who was still alive then, told them she came over from Europe to Ellis Island, and as part of that story, Rabbi, my oldest grandson, how did you come, Grandma? Just, I took a train eventually to Liverpool, and then a steamer to Ellis Island. Just, so you cruised.
Yes. Yes. I was at the pool.
Yeah, not exactly a cruise.
Yeah, I was hanging at the pool. But there is an interesting thing. I read this fascinating article a number of years ago, because there is this very common mythology that Jews had their names changed when they came to Ellis Island. That, for example, my family name in Europe was Wolkoff, and then when they got to Ellis Island, they couldn't spell it, so they just said Wolkoff, and that's where it came from.
Mm-hmm.
All right. That is not true. All right. Nobody's name was changed for them at Ellis Island. Their names could not be changed. They had extremely rigorous passport control. Everybody had to have papers. The papers needed to be consistent. And you had to have both passports and various kinds of medical records to indicate that you were not suffering from, I'm not sure exactly what it would have been, but tuberculosis maybe, but whatever it was. So you had to have all of these documents with you that had to be signed by officials back, they wouldn't let you get onto a boat without those papers, because if you came on without those papers and you were rejected at Ellis Island, the steamship company had to take you back. They weren't going to, waste any money on that. They were going to make real sure that your papers were consistent. So what that was that when you got to Ellis Island, your name was registered exactly as it was on your papers. No Irish customs official changed anybody's names. The Sean Ferguson, Shane Ferguson joke is cute. It never happened.
Yeah.
And so if names were changed, it was because people chose to change their names. And
I
so,
have a thing
so where did the mythology come from? The mythology came from an attempt to sort of compensate for the fact that people did choose to change
the names, yeah.
and they were not necessarily ashamed or embarrassed about it, but it was easier for them to blame it on somebody else than to take responsibility for it themselves. What were you going to say, Jay?
I have to disagree on that to a point. First of all, the term WAP, which we often use in terms negatively with the Italians, came about because WAP without papers.
Right.
So that was one thing. But in my family, or on my mother's side of the family, we have had a name change, not from Ferguson to Ferguson, etc. But they would often ask, "What is your name and where are you going?" In the case here, they asked it in reverse order. So we have a family person who is actually going to somebody else instead of Globerman and whatever the other person's name. We actually have that happen in the family.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So I mean, that might have been an error. That somebody mistook this for that. I mean, errors can happen, but
I mean, it was just a question of reversing the order.
Right.
What is your name and to whom are you going? And asking the other way around, so you got the two names mixed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Understood. But as a general policy, you didn't have that kind of name changing going on. They were meticulous, and the fact of the matter is, people could write. When you looked at a passport, I think about the way your passport looks. They were meticulous about the way the way the document was written. These were official documents. So I mean, could a customs guy screw up? Yeah. Would they intentionally change names? No. Just it did not happen. But the fantasy of it really tells you something about American Jewish, the ambiguities, the ambivalences of American Jewish life. The people came over and they were not necessarily holding on to all of the traditions of the past, the fantasy, the nostalgia about what it was like, and everybody was so frum and all the rest of it. Don't kid yourself. It wasn't like that at all. It wasn't like that at all. And in certain ways, in many ways, the traditional Jewish community is stronger today in America than it ever has been. Right? The time when people came over, I mean, sure, there were a lot of guys that spoke Yiddish. All right, there were a lot of guys that knew their way around a Siddur. There's a great story about my grandfather, may rest in peace, my Trotskyite grandfather, Arbeiter Verein. So he goes to shul with my father for my father's Ufruf. And now my grandfather had not ever been in a shul in America. And so when they leave, my father says to my grandfather, "So what do you think?" And my grandfather said, "That's no way to run a shul." He knew all of the davening by heart, but he never davened. Okay? He was completely alienated from it. But he went to cheder like everybody else. So there were certain kinds of skills that some people had, but the vast majority of people were unskilled and unlearned. To some extent, those were the ones that would come to America, the Trefeland. The religious people would stay back in Europe. So, guys, I think we're going to finish up now. Okay. Just want to remind you, we've got a class tomorrow at 12:30 about Deuteronomy. We're going to talk about the laws of the king in Deuteronomy. And then on Thursday night, I've got my lecture about the San Remo Accord. which is a very important for understanding about Israel's history. It's a really important document.
The
So,
laws of the king. Huh? I'm going to make sure Arlene listens in tomorrow, Rabbi.
yeah, you'd be surprised at how powerless he is.
Oh,
Yeah, maybe you wouldn't be surprised.
she knows it. Thank you very much,
Right.
Rabbi.
Have a great night, everybody.
Good night, Jay. Good night,
Night,
Jay.
Jay.
Thank you.
Good night.